Though the Seven Kingdoms had known countless upheavals in their long and bloody history, the War of the Five Kings was destined to reshape the political landscape in ways few lords or small folk could have imagined. Yet, in the shifting fortunes of that chaotic time, there was one decision, one divergence from the expected path that changed everything. When Prince Doran Martell of Dorne decided to forsake his centuries-long enmity with the North in favor of forging a bold new alliance with House Stark, ripples traveled across rivers, through deserts, over mountains, and across the icy plains of the far north. What followed was a tapestry of betrayal, loyalty, heartbreak, and victory, and it would be recounted for generations. A new ballad composed by the Dornish singers and the northern bards alike. This strange union began in secret, the seeds of its inception planted deep in the hearts of those who had long endured the injustices committed by House Lannister. Dorne had endured the loss of Elia Martell, Prince Oberyn's beloved sister, during the sacking of King's Landing at the end of Robert's rebellion. Her children had been slaughtered. Her memory was honored in the scalding sun of Sunspear, though the pain refused to fade. Prince Doran Martell had grown older, but his patience had only grown sharper. He yearned to see his house avenged and, more than that, to set a new foundation for Dornish independence, or at least autonomy. While many believed that Doran's cunning was directed solely toward King's Landing and the Iron Throne, the truth was that he kept his ears open to the entire realm. When whispers reached him that Eddard Stark had been unjustly executed by the order of King Joffrey Baratheon, Doran initially felt little stirring. The North had not been a long-time friend of Dorne, nor was it a likely ally. But as the conflict widened, as the Boy King's cruelty manifested in heavier taxation, brutality, and the fracturing of the Seven Kingdoms, the Prince of Dorne quietly began to question his long-standing neutrality. Word came of Robb Stark's coronation as king in the North. The young wolf, they called him. They also called him honorable, though savage in war, as unstoppable as his direwolf. Doran read the letters from ravens with a stoic expression, weighed the outrages of House Lannister, and wondered if the time for Dornish vengeance was near. Far to the north, amidst snowdrifts and howling winds, Catelyn Stark received a small, unmarked missive. It was delivered by a messenger who wore no cloak of any particular house, a silent figure who slipped into the camp under cover of darkness. It stated that there was a way to strike at the Lannisters from the south. That Dorne, if properly courted, would consider an alliance with the king in the north. There was no formal signature at the end, but she knew well who had penned it. The style, clear, direct, and shrouded, pointed to Doran Martell, or at least one of his sworn swords. Catelyn took these letters to her son. Robb Stark was weary from planning the next moves of the war. He had parted ways with his close friend and advisor Theon Greyjoy, who had been sent to treat with Balon Greyjoy. He could sense the precarious situation the North found itself in. Battered by war, surrounded by enemies, reliant on bannermen whose loyalty might waver if this war dragged on too long. He read the missive carefully, the corners of his mouth tightening into a firm line. The North had never stood with Dorne, not once in its ancient history. But then again, what was tradition in a time of war and survival? Robb Stark did not rush into decisions. He gathered his most trusted lords, Roose Bolton of the Dreadfort, the great Jon Umber, Galbart Glover, Rickard Karstark, and a few others, to speak openly of the proposal. Catelyn argued in favor, suggesting that the resources, the cunning, and the strategic southern location of Dorne could serve as the anvil against which the Lannisters might break. Others were skeptical, citing centuries-old prejudices and cautioning that the Dornishmen were not to be trusted. Yet Robb listened to his mother and to his own counsel, and he decided to send emissaries south. He wrote in his own hand that he would welcome an alliance, so long as Dorne was prepared to wage true war against the Iron Throne. Within a fortnight, the ravens made their way to Sunspear. In the shadows of the Water Gardens, Prince Doran Martell smiled to himself. It was not a triumphant smile, but the expression of a man who saw a more complicated puzzle begin to resolve. He thought of his brother Oberyn, who had been away from Dorne for some time. Oberyn was known for his fury, for his sense of justice, and for his readiness to avenge Elia. If Oberyn discovered that Doran was about to join forces with the Starks, the Red Viper would be delighted, and perhaps less cautious. Dorne needed caution, for his plans extended far beyond this single alliance. So he kept these negotiations quiet, disclosing the news only to a few close confidants. When Oberyn Martell returned to Dorne, fresh from his journeys across the seas, his brother finally shared the whispers of a forthcoming pact with the Starks. It was said that Oberyn's eyes flashed like twin coals, equally bright with interest and raw fury at their old enemies in King's Landing. So the young wolf would have the Dornishman by his side, he said, pacing around Doran's private solar. He must be desperate, but then again, so are we if we truly wish for vengeance. The Lannisters took Elia. They took her children. Now, let them face the hot sun of Dorne and the biting cold of the north together. Doran only nodded. Yet we must proceed with a delicate hand. We do not want to rouse King's Landing until we are certain the north will stand. We must glean what the rest of the realm might do if we stir. We must consider the Tyrells, the Baratheons, and that cunning fox known as Peter Baelish. We must be sure not to overcommit too soon. But I see no future for Dorne as long as House Lannister holds the Iron Throne and that venomous boy sits upon it. So letters continued to flow north, and after many weeks of negotiation, Robb Stark dispatched one of his most trusted emissaries, Ser Edmure Tully of Riverrun, to cross the Bone Way with a small retinue. Accompanying him was a cautious, duty-bound maester. Their journey was long, full of dust and the scorching sun, so different from the damp north. They observed the towering red mountains and the forbidding passes. Dornish outriders met them on the dusty road, escorted them through sentinel stands of cacti and rocky outcrops, until finally the spires of Sunspear rose from the horizon like a mirage. Prince Doran Martell received Edmure Tully with courtesy, though not with pageantry. They spoke in low voices behind closed doors. Oberyn was there, too, fierce and direct, demanding details of the North's plan to break the Lannisters. For his part, Edmure painted a picture of a North eager to remain free of the Iron Throne for good, forging an alliance that would recognize Dornish autonomy. In exchange, the Dornish hosts would ride against the Lannisters from the south, cutting off supply lines and harassing the Kingsguard. He held a letter sealed with direwolf sigils, guaranteeing that House Stark recognized Dorne's right to punish House Lannister for their crimes against Elia and her children. Oberyn nearly laughed with approval, his expression full of savage glee. Doran said little, only that there were details to finalize. The emissaries were fed and quartered, given soft beds in the palace, and assured that a reply would come soon. Unbeknownst to them, the very next morning a raven flew north with a simple message. Dorne will stand. Let the wolves howl. Let us feast on the lion's heart. Across the vast distances, along the Trident and through the Neck, the news arrived in Robb Stark's war camp. The boy king held the parchment in his hands. Around him stood the Great John, Rickard Karstark, and Roose Bolton, all with guarded expressions. They wondered if they could truly trust Dorne, yet they could not deny the strategic advantage. Robb finally summoned his generals, hammered out a fresh plan for pressing an attack on Lannister positions in the Riverlands, and bade them prepare for a southern offensive to coincide with the Dornish. The War of the Five Kings took its shape, each faction shifting like water around the mountain that was House Lannister. Stannis Baratheon was preparing to lay siege to King's Landing. Renly Baratheon had only just been murdered beneath the walls of Storm's End, though rumors of shadowy sorcery flickered among the common folk. Joffrey Baratheon, still enthroned, was propped up by the cunning of his grandfather Tywin and the coin of the crown. Robb Stark remained in the field, undefeated, though he had yet to secure a lasting victory that could break House Lannister's power. And in the midst of all these swirling forces, Doran Martell quietly moved his pieces on the board, forging new alliances behind walls built of hot Dornish sand. Tywin Lannister learned of the Martell-Stark alliance via his many spies. When the rumor was first laid before him, the old lion found it difficult to believe. Dorne and the North? Ridiculous, he muttered. They have nothing in common but an old hatred for our house. Yet as more ravens brought word that men in Martell livery were gathering along the Prince's Pass, Tywin recognized the threat. He dispatched scouts, pored over maps, and began reconsidering his own deployments. Cersei Lannister was livid, pacing the halls of the Red Keep, barking orders at her guards. She demanded that the Prince of Dorne be reminded of the crown's generosity, that they could still betroth Myrcella Baratheon to Trystane Martell. But the words were empty. The pact with House Lannister had been too little, too late, and the memory of Elaya's murder stood between them like a ghost of flame and blood. It was Oberyn Martell who led the first real strike in the name of the Martell-Stark alliance. He took a company of Dornish spearmen, fierce riders, and a small retinue of archers up through the Prince's Pass, forging quietly through the Serpentine Path under cover of night. Word was that a Lannister force led by Ser Gregor Clegane was harassing the Stormlands, hoping to quell any further Baratheon uprisings. Oberyn hungered for a meeting with the Mountain, the man rumored to have killed Elaya's son and daughter. Whether the story was wholly accurate or not, Oberyn believed it with every fiber of his being. A skirmish took shape at an outpost near Summerhall, the abandoned Targaryen summer palace, where the Dornish forces caught Gregor Clegane's raiding party by surprise. It was a sharp and brutal clash. Clegane's men were mostly mounted knights and hardened sellswords who had grown used to ravaging the countryside uncontested. But Oberyn's group included some of the best spearmen in Dorne, as well as skilled archers who perched along the rocky ridges. As soon as the alarm was sounded, arrows fell from the sky, plunging into the Lannister outriders. The sun might have been setting, but it was still bright enough for the Dornish to see their targets. Clegane roared commands to form a defensive line, but Oberyn was already upon them, spitting curses in the common tongue and in his mother's tongue, the old Rhoynish phrases that turned the air to smoke with passion. His spear darted out with lethal precision, dropping Lannister men from their saddles. The Dornish, though outnumbered, wielded the advantage of terrain and surprise. Their desert-bred horses navigated the rocky ground with ease, and the spearmen swarmed like wasps. The Mountain, for his part, was a brutal force, swinging his massive sword in wide arcs, hacking down 3 men before they could even blink. But Oberyn, keen-eyed and cunning, kept his distance, using his spear to probe, to bait, to keep Gregor Clegane turning in circles. Around them, the clash of steel rang, men screaming as spear points found chinks in their armor. The night air reeked of blood and adrenaline. Then Oberyn saw his opening. Gregor stumbled over an outcropping of broken stone near the remains of a collapsed wall. Oberyn lunged in, burying the tip of his spear into the Mountain's side, an attack that would have killed many men. But Gregor was no ordinary man. He bellowed with rage, tore the spear from his body, and advanced on Oberyn with murder in his eyes. Though the fight was savage, Oberyn's men came to his aid, and the Mountain found himself pressed on multiple fronts. Dornish arrows flew in again, peppering Gregor's troops, leaving them cornered and out of formation. An arrow found the chink in the Mountain's thick plate, striking near the armor's joint. Blood poured down his arm. Oberyn seized the moment to force the Mountain onto the defensive, launching another precise thrust. Gregor roared, parried it, but stumbled. It might have ended there, with Oberyn finally avenging his sister. But fortune is a fickle thing, and the Mountain's men swarmed in to protect him. The Prince of Dorne found his path blocked by an enormous Lannister knight who nearly crushed Oberyn beneath his destrier's hooves. When Oberyn spun free, Gregor was already hoisted onto a spare horse by his surviving men. With a final hateful glare, the Mountain and his battered party retreated into the night, leaving the Dornish in possession of the field. The skirmish was won, though Oberyn cursed the sky for letting Gregor slip away. Still, the impact of this clash echoed through the realm. Word spread that the Red Viper of Dorne had struck a grievous wound against the Lannisters. The rumor grew in the telling. Some said Oberyn had struck Gregor down entirely. Others said he had snapped the Mountain sword in half. Whatever the details, the truth was that the Dornish had come out of the pass and drawn first blood, and this resonated like a clarion call to other houses that harbored grudges against the Lannisters. Robb Stark, for his part, recognized the opportunity. He marched swiftly into the Riverlands, consolidating his power. The northern host swarmed around Harrenhal, capturing the massive fortress from a complacent Lannister guard. Once inside, Robb was appalled at the atrocities committed by the Mountain's men. He found some prisoners loyal to the Tullis, freed them, and set about placing a strong garrison under the command of Roose Bolton. From Harrenhal, he planned to move south again, potentially to link with the Dornish. His mother, Catelyn, urged caution, as she worried about Tywin Lannister's cunning. But the alliance with Dorne gave them a sense of momentum, a sense that perhaps the tides were turning in favor of the king in the north. In King's Landing, tensions ran high. The small council began to fracture. Littlefinger, noticing that the Lannisters were pressed on multiple fronts, saw an opportunity to further his own ambitions by sowing discord. Varys, the Spider, seemed perplexed. Dorne's sudden involvement was not entirely unexpected, yet the speed of their aggression caught him by surprise. He wondered who else might join the fray. He heard rumors that House Tyrell was biding its time, waiting for the right moment to decide between Stannis, the Lannisters, or any other that offered them power. Cersei demanded that her father take immediate steps to crush the Dornish. Tywin had no illusions about how challenging that would be. The Prince's Pass and the Boneway were narrow, well-defended routes. The southern seas were patrolled by Dornish vessels in alliance with the Redwyne fleet. Quietly, the lords of the Arbor were growing sympathetic to any faction that could promise them profitable trade after the war. So Tywin focused instead on trying to contain the threat. He recalled certain forces from the Westerlands, posted them near the Stormlands, and began fortifying the roads. Yet Tywin also recognized a harsh truth. If the North and Dorne persisted in coordinating, King's Landing was dangerously vulnerable. The Crown's resources were already stretched by Joffrey's extravagances. Renly's death had done little to quell unrest in the Reach, and Stannis Baratheon, though battered at the Battle of the Blackwater in the original timeline, was in a better position now that King's Landing faced increased pressure from the south and west. Little by little, the Iron Throne felt the cords of power unspooling from its grip. Meanwhile, the Martells made their next move. Doran sent a diplomatic party north. A caravan of sleek Dornish horses, bright silks, and heavily armed guards. At its head was Arianne Martell, his daughter and heir. She was accompanied by a retinue that included Elaria Sand, Oberyn's paramour, along with several of Oberyn's daughters, some of the famous sand snakes. Their journey was meant to seal the alliance with an official meeting, to show the realm that Dorne and the North were, indeed, joined by common purpose. Their route took them through the Stormlands, carefully avoiding open confrontation with Lannister patrols. The journey proved perilous. More than once, they had to hide in ravines or canyons, guided by loyal Stormland knights who despised the Lannisters for their cruelty. Arianne rode with poise, her black hair catching the sun, her expression resolute. She was determined to see the alliance flourish. This was not mere politics for her. It was a chance to carve a new destiny for Dorne, away from the shadows of subjugation under the Iron Throne. When the caravan reached the Riverlands, they found the region still scarred by war. Villages burned, fields trampled, small folk terrified to offer shelter. But after a tense series of introductions, the group was escorted to Riverrun, where Edmure Tully greeted them courteously. He had not expected a visit from the Princess of Dorne. He quickly sent ravens to Robb Stark, summoning him from Harrenhal to attend the negotiations. Robb's arrival was swift. He came with Grey Wind trotting beside him, the massive direwolf that had become a symbol of northern might. Arianne had never seen a direwolf in the flesh, and though she was used to the exotic and fierce animals of Dorne, the direwolf's presence sent a tiny shiver across her skin. She masked it well, inclining her head in greeting to the king in the north. They spoke in private. Arianne asked for guarantees of recognition for Dorne's autonomy, not merely once the war was finished, but in perpetuity. She wanted to ensure that if the North truly meant to secede from the Iron Throne, it would support Dorne in a similar endeavor. Robb, cautious but willing to bargain, insisted that he could not speak for all the Southern lords, but that Dorne, at minimum, would be left free to govern itself. There, in a shadowy hall of Riverrun, a new pact was sealed. The Martell crest of the sun and spear was placed alongside the direwolf banner. Arianne and Robb both signed the agreements, which were then stamped by Edmure Tully as a witness. This was not a betrothal, nor any union of that nature, but the symbolic marriage of two houses. Raven messages flew out once again, proclaiming an official alliance. House Frey, House Bolton, House Karstark, and the rest of the Tully bannermen were left with no illusions. Dorne stood with the king in the north. Though neither side could muster a single, crushing blow against the Lannisters alone, the combined pressure on two major fronts began to weigh heavily on Tywin. The Highgarden question lingered. Mace Tyrell had not yet declared for Joffrey, as in the original timeline that came after Renly's death. Instead, the Tyrells remained aloof, measuring their chances. Stannis Baratheon, from Dragonstone, eyed King's Landing and formed plans to strike while the city was in turmoil. In the Riverlands, battles raged. The Starks enjoyed many successes, yet they suffered from extended supply lines and a deep mistrust between certain northern bannermen. The Boltons in particular kept their own counsel, quietly extracting their price for each step forward. At one point, Roose Bolton hosted a lavish feast at Harrenhal, where certain Dornish envoys were also in attendance. Arianne Martell was not present at that feast. She had continued her journey to speak with other Riverland lords, but Oberyn, who had arrived from the south, was. The atmosphere was tense. Bolton's cold eyes met Oberyn's burning stare, and the two men exchanged pleasantries that bristled with underlying threats. Still, outward cooperation persisted. Oberyn needed Bolton's men to secure Harrenhal, to hold the center of the kingdom, and to keep the Lannisters from marching back south in force. Bolton needed Oberyn's might in the east, near the Stormlands. A fragile web of alliances grew, each party standing on a tightrope, aware that a single betrayal could send them all into the abyss. To the north, the nights grew colder, and news of strange happenings beyond the wall trickled down, barely registering among the war-torn lords. Far beyond the focus of men like Tywin or Doran Martell, the threat of the White Walkers began to stir. But the lords of Westeros were still fixated on the Iron Throne. As winter winds approached, Dorne made a dramatic strike at the heart of the Crownlands. Oberyn Martell, commanding a mixed force of horse and spear, advanced past the Stormlands through a hidden route known by few outside Dorne's most experienced scouts. They bypassed certain Lannister fortifications and suddenly appeared near Rosby and Stokeworth, close enough to threaten the roads leading into King's Landing. That was when panic truly set in at the Red Keep. Cersei fumed, Joffrey shrieked, and Tywin Lannister scrambled to recall enough forces to protect the city. The entire realm braced itself for a decisive confrontation. Robb Stark seized the moment to move down the King's Road, aiming to link up with the Dornish to present a united front outside the capital. He dispatched Roose Bolton to secure Harrenhal's flank and left a portion of his host under Edmure Tully to defend Riverrun. With Grey Wind scouting ahead, the king in the north pressed onward. The crossing of the Trident was uncontested, though rumors suggested a large Lannister army was gathering near the Blackwater. Word reached them that Stannis Baratheon, from Dragonstone, had also moved. His fleet was sailing up the Blackwater Bay, aiming to strike King's Landing from the sea. If all these forces converged at once, the northern host, the Dornish army, and Stannis's navy, the capital would be encircled, and House Lannister's position might become untenable. In that moment of tension, Doran Martell sent another message, imploring Robb to slow his approach so that Dorne could coordinate more precisely. Doran believed that if the city fell too quickly, Stannis might claim credit for the victory, undermining the Martell Stark effort. A unified, carefully timed strike was necessary for maximum leverage. Robb, however, was under pressure from his bannermen to strike while Tywin's forces were divided and King's Landing in chaos. Ultimately, King in the north and Prince of Dorne agreed upon a date. They would meet near the old ruin of Bramsfort, a minor castle just southeast of the Blackwater Rush. Once joined, they would march on the city as one. But wars rarely adhere to neat timetables. Tywin Lannister, with his typical cunning, recognized that if he could not hold the city in a straightforward siege, he would at least sow discord among his enemies. He sent messages to the Tyrells, promising them dominion over the Reach and lavish rewards if they would come to the crown's aid. He also covertly dispatched a letter to Walder Frey, hinting that if House Frey were to betray the Starks at a critical juncture, all manner of rewards and titles would await them. and so the seeds of treachery were sown. Walder Frey, resentful of perceived slights by the Starks, found Tywin's offer tempting. But he also feared the wrath of the combined armies of the North and Dorne. For the moment, the Freys hesitated, waiting for a guaranteed moment to strike. Meanwhile, in a surprising twist, Mace Tyrell declared for the king in the North and Dorne. He had grown tired of Lannister arrogance, and he sensed that the Baratheon cause under Stannis offered him little. For the Tyrells, if they joined Robb Stark and Prince Doran, they might claim a major role in reshaping the monarchy, or toppling it entirely. The arrival of Margaery Tyrell and her ladies at Riverrun signaled a new complexity to the alliance. Margaery was a shrewd observer, noticing how Aerion Martell and Robb Stark interacted, and even how Catelyn Stark looked upon these new alliances with wary hope. With Highgarden's banners rising, Tywin was forced to retreat from the Stormlands to defend the roads leading into King's Landing. But this only gave Oberyn Martell an opening to press forward, capturing a series of minor strongholds near Rosby. The Red Viper's cunning was on full display. He raided supply lines, freed captives, and even threatened to cut off the main trade route between the Crownlands and the Vale. Yet the hammer blow had yet to fall. As the combined Stark and Martell forces drew closer to Bramsfort, they encountered pockets of stiff Lannister resistance, delaying them. Skirmishes erupted almost daily. The weather turned foul, with cold rains pelting the weary soldiers. Northern men shivered. Dornish men complained of mud that sucked the boots from their feet. Nevertheless, they pushed on, for all believed that soon they would stand at the gates of the Red Keep itself. At last, near the cusp of autumn, King in the north and Prince of Dorne's main forces met in the shadow of Bramsfort's battered walls. Banners snapped in the wind. The dire wolf of House Stark, the sun and spear of House Martell, the trout of House Tully, and a smattering of other sigils that had joined their cause. Robb and Oberyn greeted each other with a tension-laden nod. This was the first time Robb had personally laid eyes on the Red Viper, and he was struck by the older man's controlled energy. Oberyn, for his part, sized up the young wolf, noting his quiet intensity, the steel in his blue eyes, and the loyal direwolf that prowled close by. During a hurried war council in Bramsfort's Great Hall, the two leaders outlined the final approach. They knew that if they captured the city quickly, there would be chaos. Stannis Baratheon's fleet was expected any day now. If Stannis arrived to find the city gates battered down by the combined Northern and Dornish forces, he might attempt to seize the throne by force. But if they timed it right, they could crush the Lannisters and parley with Stannis on more equal terms, or even keep him from landing at all. On a cold morning, under a gray sky, the Allied army marched toward King's Landing. Scouts reported that Tywin Lannister's host had been sighted along the Blackwater. A second force, commanded by the Kingsguard, was inside the city itself. Tension spread through the ranks. Men checked their swords, tightened saddles, and prayed to their various gods. As the city's walls rose in the distance, the clangor of bells reached their ears. Perhaps it was the city's attempt to rally defenders, or maybe Cersei wrung them in fear. No one could say. Siege engines were rolled forward, and Dornish archers took positions, ready to rain arrows on the battlements. The northern cavalry massed, waiting for Robb's signal. The entire field stretched out before them, muddy and covered in the debris of war. Tywin's army was drawn up to block their approach to the city. The old lion himself sat astride a pale horse, clad in gleaming plate. Beside him rode Kevan Lannister, as well as other high-born knights. Their banners displayed the Golden Lion of Lannister, though the men beneath them looked strained, aware that they were outnumbered and that part of the city's garrison was led by the inexperienced King Joffrey and his hound, Sandor Clegane. The battle that followed would be remembered for both its ferocity and its swiftness. Robb's plan relied on smashing through the Lannister lines with a combination of heavy cavalry charges from the north and a flanking maneuver by the Dornish spearmen. As the horns sounded, Great Jon Umber roared a war cry, spurring his horse forward. The thunder of hooves shook the ground. The Lannisters held formation initially, but the northern cavalry slammed into them like a hammer. Horses screamed, steel clashed, men fell beneath the press. Moments later, The Red Viper's spear companies swept in from the flank, their precision and discipline honed in the harsh training yards of Sunspear. Tywin's men were forced to turn, and in that turning, a gap opened in their lines. It was then that Robb Stark, leading his personal guard, drove straight into the breach. The roar of direwolves seemed to fill the air, for not only Grey Wind but the other Stark direwolves were present, near the baggage train or with the younger Stark boys who had come down from the north. The effect on Lannister morale was immediate and profound. Some knights tried to stand their ground, but they were overwhelmed. Others fled, seeking the dubious safety of the city walls. Tywin fought valiantly, cutting down more than one northern knight. He struggled to maintain cohesion among his forces, but the tide had turned. Kevan Lannister called for retreat, and many of the Lion's men turned tail. Realizing that the day was lost, Tywin barked an order and the remainder of his cavalry peeled away, galloping south. With the Lannister host shattered, the combined forces of House Stark and House Martell stood poised at the gate of King's Landing. The city's defenders on the walls began to waver. Some called for the gates to be closed tighter, while others muttered about surrender. Then the sound of horns echoed from the bay. Stannis Baratheon's ships had arrived, their sails bearing the flaming heart. The tension in the city boiled over. In the Red Keep, Cersei shrieked at Joffrey to do something, but the Boy King only cowered. Sandor Clegane gathered a unit of the Kingsguard to try to hold the castle. The small folk, terrified of siege or sacking, started rioting in Flea Bottom, some blaming the Lannisters, others simply trying to loot or escape. Amidst this chaos, Robb Stark and Oberyn Martell conferred. Oberyn wanted to storm the gates immediately, while Robb worried about bloodshed among innocent people. Ultimately, the gates were battered down. Dornish archers scaled the walls. A portion of the North's cavalry forced open an old sally port. Resistance was fierce in places, but it lacked coordination. King's Landing was never designed to withstand an attack from both land and sea at once, and while Stannis hammered at the Mudgate from his ships, the Martell-Stark alliance pressed from the north. Within hours, the city fell into their hands. The Red Keep stood as the last bastion of Lannister power, but even that was threatened when large sections of the Gold Cloaks began to open the gates from within, anxious to avoid a prolonged siege. In the throne room, Joffrey raged, calling for the heads of every traitor. Cersei tried to hold him back, while the Hound quietly slipped away, losing his taste for protecting this monstrous boy. Finally, Robb Stark and Oberyn Martell entered the Red Keep. Robb's armor was stained with the mud of the battlefield, his hair damp with sweat. Oberyn's spear still dripped with Lannister blood. They found Joffrey perched on the Iron Throne, flanked by a few remaining Kingsguard. The Boy King shrieked threats, but fear flashed in his eyes. Oberyn demanded the Boy King be delivered to him for justice. He had not forgotten the crimes committed against Elia Martell. Robb looked upon Joffrey with ice in his gaze, remembering how Ned Stark's head had been struck from his shoulders at this child's command. The Kingsguard hesitated, then stepped away, for they saw no victory in dying to protect the boy. Joffrey squealed, calling them cowards, but it was over. Cersei, pale and trembling, tried to intervene, but she was swiftly taken into custody. The Lannister reign in King's Landing had ended. Outside, Stannis's men were pushing into the city, claiming certain districts. But seeing that the Martell-Stark army had effectively taken the Red Keep, Stannis withdrew to the bay and sent an envoy to parley. In the days that followed, the city was rife with rumors. Some said Robb Stark would proclaim himself king of Westeros, while others insisted that Oberyn would avenge Elia by burning King's Landing to the ground. In truth, both the North and Dorne wanted to see the Lannisters stripped of power, but neither had great desire to occupy the entire realm. Robb's aim was the North's freedom, while Doran Martell, through Oberyn, desired retribution and official recognition of Dornish independence or near independence. A hasty council was held in the Red Keep. Stannis arrived, flanked by Melisandre of Asshai and Ser Davos Seaworth, to assert his right as the only trueborn son of King Robert. The hall was tense, with King in the north, Prince of Dorne, and the would-be king of the Seven Kingdoms all under one roof. Catelyn Stark stood beside her son, wearing a stern expression. Arianne Martell observed quietly, ready to speak for her father. Negotiations threatened to break down when Oberyn challenged Stannis' claim, saying that House Targaryen had once ruled, that House Baratheon had usurped them in an unholy alliance with Tywin Lannister, who slaughtered the helpless. But cooler heads prevailed. Robb, seeing an opportunity to avoid further bloodshed, proposed a compromise. The North would be granted independence and recognized as a separate kingdom, with the loyalty of certain Riverland houses. Dorne would be allowed to set its own governance, retaining only a loose fealty to the Iron Throne if it so chose, enough to keep trade open, but minimal enough to grant it near-sovereign status. In exchange, the rest of the realm, from the Crownlands to the Westerlands and the Stormlands, would acknowledge Stannis as the rightful king. Stannis was reluctant, for he desired the entire realm's obedience. But Melisandre whispered of an enemy in the north, a darkness rising beyond the wall, and Davos pointed out that continuing the war might only break the realm further. Weary of battle and mindful of his duty, Stannis accepted the terms, though not without a heavy heart. Thus began a new order. The Red Viper demanded immediate justice for those who had killed his sister Elia. Tywin Lannister had escaped the battle, fleeing with remnants of his army. Gregor Clegane was said to be near death from his wounds but remained at large. Joffrey was taken into custody, along with his mother, to stand trial for Ned Stark's execution and other crimes. Tommen and Myrcella were found cowering in their chambers. Myrcella had been betrothed to Trystane Martell once, but that arrangement was now moot, replaced by the fresh realities of war. Stannis set about a brutal crackdown on remaining Lannister loyalists. Robb Stark was content to remain in King's Landing only long enough to see Joffrey brought to justice and sign the new pacts. He had grown uneasy in the southern capital, longing for the crisp air of the north. The repeated talk of White Walkers by a few members of the Night's Watch who had arrived seeking aid weighed heavily on him. Meanwhile, the Dornish, under Prince Doran's guidance, looked ahead to the future. With the Lannisters humbled, their vengeance had been partially served. But the wounds of history ran deep, and Oberyn in particular wanted to pursue Tywin to the ends of the earth if necessary. For the moment, however, the Red Viper was hailed as a hero by many of the small folk in King's Landing, who were relieved that the city had not endured a prolonged siege and a brutal sack. It was said that Oberyn's presence had ironically saved more lives than it had taken, for the fear of the Red Viper caused many to surrender rather than fight. In the weeks that followed, a series of trials were conducted. Joffrey Baratheon's trial was the most sensational, presided over by King Stannis and attended by lords from across the realm. Evidence was presented of his cruelty, including testimonies of the Stark household, statements from Sansa Stark, who found herself with conflicting emotions, and from surviving members of the Kingsguard. In the end, Joffrey was found guilty of murder and numerous abuses. Stannis, with grim finality, pronounced a sentence of death. Oberyn Martell demanded the right to name a champion in a trial by combat. Joffrey, panicked, demanded Ser Meryn Trant champion him. Robb Stark suggested that Oberyn should be allowed to face them if it came to that, for he would have claimed the right to vengeance for House Martell. Yet Stannis insisted that this was no time for spectacle. The verdict had been rendered through conventional trial. Joffrey's last moments were inglorious, and they brought no great joy to anyone, for so much blood had already been spilled. With Joffrey gone, the realm took a collective breath. Cersei Lannister, now a prisoner, glared at her captors with hatred. Tywin Lannister remained at large, rumored to be in the Westerlands, gathering what remained of his power. Stannis named a new hand of the king, Ser Davos Seaworth, who many believed was too humble and honest for the role, but who quickly gained respect. As the dust settled, Robb Stark prepared to lead his armies home. He had what he wanted, recognition as the king in the north. The Riverlands swore fealty to him, though some lords remained uncertain about the future. Walder Frey's treacherous leanings had been discovered before he could act, thanks to a timely interception of Tywin's letters. Robb stripped the Freys of key positions, awarding them to lords loyal to House Tully. Doran Martell, for his part, returned to Sunspear in triumph, albeit a quiet triumph. He had orchestrated the weakening of House Lannister, removed Joffrey from the throne, and secured Dorne's near independence without exposing his homeland to large-scale devastation. The small folk of Dorne celebrated for days, praising the Martells for avenging Elia. Oberyn, restless as ever, lingered a while in King's Landing, seeking word of the mountain's whereabouts. If Gregor Clegane yet lived, Oberyn intended to hunt him down personally. In an extraordinary turn, the Tyrells negotiated a marriage between Margaery Tyrell and King Stannis, forging a delicate peace in the realm. Margaery possessed a keen political sense and quickly worked to unify the Crownlands and the Reach. Though the city still nursed its bruises, the presence of the Tyrells brought food from the south, lessening the famine that threatened King's Landing after the siege. Yet not all was resolved. Tywin Lannister, like an old wolf cut from its pack, roamed the Westerlands, rallying bannermen who refused to bend the knee to Stannis. Rumors suggested he might even approach the Iron Bank of Bravos for loans to raise sellswords, a last gambit to restore House Lannister's fortunes. In the north, tensions simmered regarding the Bolton alliance. Roose Bolton, newly made Warden of the Dreadfort, had grown increasingly distant from Robb's cause, especially after failing to secure certain concessions he desired. The Karstarks also had their grievances. Lord Rickard Karstark still fumed over perceived slights involving the Lannisters who had killed 2 of his sons. And then there was the matter of the Wall. Ravens from Castle Black begged for men to defend against wildlings and darker threats beyond the frozen wilderness. Jon Snow, newly returned to the Watch after infiltrating the wildling ranks, sent messages to his half-brother, warning that the real war was yet to come. But the lords and ladies of the realm, exhausted by the War of the Five Kings, were slow to rally. Still, in this altered timeline, there was a glimmer of hope. Hope that unity might be found in time to face the winter storms. The North stood strong under Robb Stark's leadership, possessing its independence but maintaining ties to the broader realm. Dorne was free in all but name, guided by Doran Martell's cautious hand and Oberyn's passionate spear. Stannis Baratheon occupied the Iron Throne, determined to wage war on what he believed were the realm's true enemies, the undead in the far north and the ambitions of Tywin Lannister. The Tyrells and Tullis had joined the new order, seeking stability and prosperity. Little by little, roads were rebuilt and trade resumed. Dornish merchants made their way to Winterfell, marveling at the towering pines and the swirling snows. Northern emissaries journeyed to Sunspear, sweating under the desert sun and sampling spiced wines. A few daring minstrels even wove new ballads, telling of how the wolf and the sun joined forces to cast down the lion, forging a new page in the annals of Westeros. Yet such a fragile peace could not last forever. Tywin Lannister's final stand drew many lesser lords who feared the wrath of Stannis or bristled at the idea of 2 kingdoms in Westeros. Balon Greyjoy, who had also declared himself a king, took advantage of the strife to raid the western coasts. House Greyjoy's Ironborn sacked Lannisport while Tywin's men were occupied inland. There were rumors that Euron Greyjoy had returned, bringing with him strange artifacts from across the seas. Back in the Red Keep, Oberyn Martell, who had tarried after the victory, finally received news of Gregor Clegane's whereabouts. The mountain was said to be convalescing in a remote fortress in the Westerlands, near the borders of the Reach. Oberyn wasted no time, gathering a small band of Dornish spearmen. Against the Council of Doran, who urged caution, Oberyn rode out. The story of Oberyn's final duel with Gregor Clegane would be told in many ways over the years, but all agreed it was a clash of unstoppable force and immovable vengeance. Some accounts claim the mountain died howling in agony, his skull crushed by the Red Viper's spear. Others say Oberyn took a mortal wound but spat in Gregor's face before the beast drew his last breath. Whatever the truth, both men vanished from the stage of history that day, leaving behind only legends and a sense of grim satisfaction for House Martell. Word reached Doran Martell that his brother would not be returning. The Prince of Dorne sealed himself in his chambers for a full day, mourning in silence. Then he rose, determined to secure the legacy Oberyn had helped create, Dorne's future, free of Lannister domination. Meanwhile, Robb Stark rode for the north with his host. Along the way, he visited Riverrun, where Edmure Tully welcomed him warmly, but concerns about bandits and broken men wandering the war-torn countryside loomed. Near the twins, Walder Frey slouched in his seat, forced to comply with Robb's passage after the discovery of his treacherous correspondences. For all his resentment, the late attempts at betrayal had failed, and the North's memory was long. Finally, the king in the North returned to Winterfell, which had been partially burned by the traitorous Ironborn in an earlier raid. Many northern lords had worked diligently to rebuild it. As Robb dismounted in the courtyard, gray wind by his side, he felt a pang of sorrow for all that had been lost. His father, two of his sisters still missing, for Arya and Sansa's whereabouts were uncertain for a time, and the childhood innocence shattered by war. Yet he also felt a swelling pride in what had been preserved. The honor of the North, the independence for which so many had bled, and a promising alliance that stretched all the way to sun-kissed Dorne. From then on, the realm settled into an uneasy peace. Stannis Baratheon issued edicts to round up any remaining loyalists of Joffrey's regime, though he found less success hunting Tywin Lannister, who eluded capture for many moons, waging a desperate guerrilla war in the Westerlands. The Greyjoys raided at will until Stannis dispatched part of his new royal fleet, bolstered by Tyrell ships, to scour them from the seas. Doran Martell, aging and plagued by gout, ruled Dorne with a steady hand. Aerion, stepping forward as the new heir, corresponded with Robb Stark on matters of trade, exchanging sweets and salted fish, exotic fabrics and northern furs. Some whispered that Aerion might wed Robb to unite the two realms more firmly, but others pointed out that Robb's heart was still bound by duty to a Frey bride in the original arrangement, or rumored loves in the Riverlands. No one knew for certain. Songs were sung of a possible union, the wolf and the sun, and gossip spread that they had exchanged tokens at the victory feast in King's Landing. But for the time being, no betrothal was announced. The real challenge arrived with the first snows of a truly bitter winter. The king in the north found his domain locked in ice, while beyond the wall, the others stirred. Messengers from the Night's Watch made clear that only a united realm could hope to stand against the oncoming darkness. Robb, as king of the north, faced a dilemma. Should he call upon Stannis for aid, perhaps relinquishing some measure of the North's independence for the sake of survival? Should he entreat Dorne to send men, though how would Dornish spearmen fare in the bitter cold? Desperate times bred desperate measures. Robb sent envoys south once more, explaining the threat. Stannis, newly crowned in King's Landing, listened but was preoccupied with stabilizing his hold on the throne. Even so, the king took the threat seriously, dispatching men under the banner of the Royal Stag and Flame to the wall. Dorne, however, hesitated, understandably so, for the idea of an undead army in the polar darkness seemed like the ravings of madmen. But memories of the Targaryen dragons had once seemed unbelievable too, and the Dornish had learned that legends could be real. Slowly, small contingents from Dorne traveled north, ironically crossing the same bone-dry passes that had once brought them to war. Now they came in search of truth, of a rumored menace that threatened all men equally. They arrived at the wall to see the swirling snows and the glimpses of strange shapes in the distance. Men wearing black cloaks guided them, explaining all they had seen. The Dornish found themselves chilled to the bone, yet also awakened to the reality that the world was more fragile than they had imagined. In a final stroke of unity, a grand council was convened at Winterfell. Representatives came from across the continent. Stannis Baratheon sent Davos Seaworth, the Tyrells sent a younger son of Mace Tyrell, Dorne sent Aerion Martell and a small retinue of spearmen, the Riverlands sent Edmure Tully. Even a representative from the Vale arrived, for Peter Baelish had maneuvered to become Lord Protector of that region. Though not everyone trusted one another, they recognized the imperative of facing a common threat. There, in the great hall of Winterfell, Robb Stark rose to speak. He spoke not as a conqueror nor simply as king in the north, but as a man who had seen the realm sundered by war and now faced with an even more terrifying foe. He called for unity, for every corner of Westeros to send men, supplies, and aid to the wall. He invoked the memory of his father, Ned Stark, and the oaths the Night's Watch had upheld for thousands of years. He said that if the realm did not stand together, they would fall one by one. A hush descended over the hall. Arianne Martell, recalling how the Stark alliance had helped free Dorne from the Lannisters, stood and promised that she would do all in her power to send Dornish spears. The Tyrell envoy agreed to provide grain and supplies, though they made it clear they expected some trade considerations in return. Davos Seaworth pledged King Stannis' commitment, though he also indicated that the Iron Throne would expect a measure of fealty from the North if Stannis was to sacrifice resources. Robb Stark, with a grim smile, said that the North would not kneel again, yet he recognized that this was no time for stubborn pride. A compromise was reached. The North would remain independent, but a special arrangement would be formed allowing Stannis to call upon northern forces if the rest of the realm was in mortal danger, and vice versa. It was the closest thing to unity that Westeros had seen since the beginning of the War of the Five Kings. And so, with Dorne at their side, the North found itself better positioned than in any other telling of the war. The combined strength of the southern spears, the cunning of Stannis' new monarchy, and the looming might of the North all coalesced into a single, tenuous alliance against the rising cold. No one could say if they would stand or fall against the ancient evil stirring beyond the wall, but for the first time in living memory, the realm was not entirely broken. Far away in Sunspear, Prince Doran Martell watched the sea from his balcony, the warm wind stirring the curtains. He remembered his youth, the promise of Elaya's bright smile, Oberyn's fiery nature, and the heartbreak that had shaped his life. He thought of the alliance that had once seemed impossible. Wolves and vipers, winter and summer, ice and desert. Yet somehow, in the swirl of war, it had come to pass, and the lions had fallen from their pedestal. For Doran, it was an imperfect victory, a realm still bristling with divisions. But it was also the fulfillment of a dream, a chance to guide Dorne through the fires of vengeance into a new dawn. And far to the north, Robb Stark walked the walls of Winterfell, feeling the biting wind on his cheeks. Grey Wind paced beside him, ears perked. Despite all the hardship, all the sorrow, he felt a cautious optimism. They had driven the Lannisters from the seat of power, avenged his father's wrongful death, and protected the integrity of the North. Allied with Dorne, he had seen the might of two extreme corners of Westeros unite to accomplish the impossible. There was still so much left undone. His missing sisters, the threat of the others, the question of whether Tywin Lannister would ever answer for his crimes. But for now, under the gray sky of a northern winter, he allowed himself a moment of hope. In that stillness, the memory of war receded just enough for him to remember the bright banners that had once flown side by side, the white direwolf against a field of gray, and the sun pierced by a spear on a field of orange. Two symbols of houses that had been enemies in an older age, now joined by necessity, by shared enmity toward the Lannisters, and by a determination that no king, no matter how cruel, should trample on honor and justice. If the bards were to write a song of this alliance, it would be a dark tune in places, full of pitched battles, betrayals, and heartbreak. Yet it would also hold notes of triumph, of unexpected camaraderie, of a realm that discovered, however briefly, that unity could be forged across scorching deserts and icy tundras alike. The War of the Five Kings had reshaped the Seven Kingdoms more than any conflict in living memory. With Dorne siding with House Stark, what might have been a scattered rebellion transformed into a full-scale revolution that toppled the Lannisters from their perch. But the story was not over, for winter's wind howled beyond the wall, bearing the promise of a greater battle yet to come. Still, in that twilight between wars, men and women across Westeros breathed a collective sigh. They told one another that maybe, just maybe, the worst had passed. And in Sunspear's gardens, in the halls of Winterfell, in the courts of King's Landing, and in the ships sailing the narrow sea, the memory of this alliance, of Dorne's son and the North's wolf, endured, lighting a path forward through the darkest of nights.